Okay, so good morning. Today's daf, we are on page 161b. Today's daf is 162.
You're gonna have
Kuf Samach Bet. You better believe we're gonna have Rashbam, we're gonna have Tosfos. This page, the pages that the first page that we're doing is one of those pages with a little bit of Gemara and tons of Tosfos. So we got to do at least one Tosfos here of these tremendous Tosfos, and the same thing is pretty much true on the second side of the daf on Kuf Samach Bet on a bet. But we're going to back up just a little bit, even though we got to the top of Kuf Samach Bet on Aleph. We're going to back up just a little bit so that we can, remind ourselves where we're up to and have a nice flow through the rest of today. So I'm going to share my screen, and you will have that as for those who are on the screen, have that as an additional resource. So we began on Monday. We began the 10th and final chapter of Bava Batra. We're going to be celebrating the completion of Bava Batra. One of the longest Masechtot. We're going to be celebrating that. Bava Batra. You never heard of Bava Batra? That's what we've been doing for the last several months.
Days.
160 days, 161 days. No, just this one. It's 660 days. It's hard to believe. If you go through all of it, it's been over about a year.
400 days.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. So, wow. So we've been doing this for a little while. This is all, they had Maseches Nezikin was the name of the Masechet for damages. Exactly. This is in the Seder Nezikin, but it was also a Masechet that was then divided into three parts. We had Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra now. And so it was divided into three parts. Each of the three parts has 10 chapters. And now we're in the 10th and final chapter.
They celebrate Hanukkah now.
They're gonna celebrate Hanukkah shortly. We're gonna celebrate Hanukkah. Today is the third day of today's the fourth day of December, the third day of Kislev, and we're going to celebrate Hanukkah on the 25th day of Kislev. Now, of course, we begin the night before, so on the night of the 25th, we will be lighting the first candle of Hanukkah, and so that's very exciting to be thinking about. All right, but we began the 10th and final chapter of Bava Batra on Monday, and this chapter deals with debt documents. So in the opening Mishnah, we detailed two forms of these documents. There's an open document, which is what everybody thinks of. When we think of a document, we think of a piece of paper with the signatures of the witnesses at the bottom, and that's exactly what we're talking about. But there's another kind. There's a bound document. And a bound document, what they would do is they would fold the document and sign on each fold and sew each fold up so that way it would take a long time to write. And we saw, I think yesterday, maybe it was the day before, but we saw over the last 2 days that the reason that they did this is because they wanted to do it specifically in the contracts for divorce, what we call a get. Now here, this chapter is called Get Pashut, which means an open document. Get sort of literally means document, and the document that they're referring to, even though or often when we say get, we mean a divorce decree. Here we just mean any kind of contract, any kind of written IOU or document that's going to try to accomplish something. So it could be a document that is conveying land. It could be a document that's creating a divorce as what we call a get traditionally. And it could be a document that says I owe you money. And so it could be any of those things. But the Gemara explained that because Kohanim were divorcing their wives very quickly, too quickly, we created this additional process of making the document in order to allow time to slow down the process and allow time for them to calm down and rethink. Because unlike a non-Kohen who can just decide to remarry his wife as long as he hasn't married somebody else in the interim, and she hasn't married somebody else, or she hasn't married somebody else in the interim, a Kohen cannot take his wife back no matter what. Once he's divorced her, because she's now a divorcee, even though she's a divorcee from him, he can't take her back. So as a
But
result,
Dove learned there's a one important, when we learned with Dove a few days ago, there's one important point there in that community of the Kohanim, and where that happened, the reason they did it was that there was most of the community was Kohanim. So there was no one for the women to remarry. That was a community largely
interesting,
that was
interesting.
that was the point there. That was why it was so critical there, because most of the people living in that community were Kohanim. And then the women
Yeah.
could marry, not only could they not remarry their own husband, there was no one else for them to remarry.
Excellent point. So, 100%. But the bottom line is that the goal here was to slow down the process. Okay, so those were the two kinds of contract. Now, although we got again to the top of Kuf Samach Bet Amud Aleph yesterday, we're going to go back to the bottom of Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Bet so that we avoid picking up mid thought. And we had seen at the bottom of Kuf Samach Amud Bet and the top of Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Aleph that Rabbi Yochanan had invalidated documents with an erasure, meaning that if there was something erased, you needed to have some kind of indication there was going to be a problem if you didn't have anything. But the only situation where that erasure is going to be a problem is where it was large enough to say sharir v'kayam, because the concern is that we would erase the sharir v'kayam, which are the words that are put at the very end of the document, and then you would write additional terms, and then you write a new sharir v'kayam. And so that was the concern. If that's the case, it's definitely not going to be good. And so as we pick up on the fourth line from the bottom of Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Bet, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yochanan again, noting that documents with the erasures require additional language, as we're going to see right now. So again, middle of the fourth to last line, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Kol hamechakin kulan, Kol hamechakin kulan sarich sheyichtov v'dein kiyumehen. That every contract that has within it any kind of erasures is going to require that it be written in that contract. This is their certification. V'dein kiyumehen. This is the certification, meaning you have to specify what was erased so that you can then fix it. And let's take a look at the Rashbam on this. So this Rashbam is beginning of the line, 14 lines up from the bottom of the Rashbam. Kol mechakin kulan sarich shichtov kiyumehen v'lo garis v'dein. He does not specifically say that you have to refer to this is there. That all you need to do is just here are their certifications to the Perush Kol HaMechakin She'enam B'Makom Sharir B'Kayam. And you would explain and identify all of the erasures where it is not in the amount of space that says Sharir V'Kayam. Damrin Le'el D'Ksherim that Tzarech L'Kayman B'Sof Hashtar. That in order for it to be kosher, you have to have some kind of establishment of what it is at the end of the contract. Lifnei sharir v'kayam, before saying sharir v'kayam. Again, those two words, which means fixed and firm and established. You need to have that. You have to have a list of all of the erasures so that you can understand and make sure that that you've covered everything, and so that people don't think that there is a problem with the contract. Shem eina mikuyamin, because if you don't have this, ika lamemer, one could be concerned and say shemachak v'ziyef, that somebody erased and forged and created a false document. V'higiya kirtzono, and he changed it to what he wants. La'achar shenichtav hashtar, after the contract was already written. La'achar shechas moedim, and after the witness is signed. So maybe this all happened later, and so by writing it into the document, now we know that the erasures happened before, the erasures happened before the contract was signed. Okay, so that's the key element to have in the document. All right, and in addition, so that was requirement number one, is you have to have all the erasures certified. And you also need to have a the last line of the contract needs to be a discussion or a summary of the key elements of the document. And now the Rashbam is going to explain that to us. So we continue on back exactly where we left off in the Rashbam. V'tzarach sheyachzor zeu she'anu kosim b'sof hashtar v'kinyana min ploni bar ploni leploni k'kol de chasav u'mefarish le'el. That this is why at the end of every contract, in particular, we're dealing here with a sale contract. This is why at the end of our contracts it says that one party caused the other party to acquire the item, just as everything that's written and explained above.
Right.
So we identify who the parties are, what the deal is, and that we have that at the very end. That we specify and repeat the particular idea, hakatuv lamala, that was written above. V'hai v'tzarach sheyachzor, and this need that we have to go back on it, hachi meforshinan la. We're going to explain why it is. V'tzarach shelo yehei kasuv b'sof hashtar b'shita achrona shum davar chidush. We're about to explain that the reason for this is because we don't want to have something new written in the last line of a contract. B'shum tanai, or any kind of condition written in the final line of a contract. Shashar talui bo, that the contract would be dependent on that condition. She'enu katuv lamala, that is not written above. Lefisha lo nilmad b'shita achrona can mefarish kaman. As we are about to see, we're going to say that we don't want to derive anything from the final line of a document. So the Gemara asks, my time, why is it that we don't want to, that we require the summary of all the terms in the final line? So the Gemara says, as we turn to Kuf Samach Bet Amud Aleph, Amar of Amram Lefisha Ein L'Meidin Mishita Ha'achrona, because we don't want to learn anything from the final line. Let's take a look again in the Rashbam. Now Rashbam explains why is it that we don't want to learn anything from the final line. Amram Rav Amram, top of Rashbam on Kuf Samach Bet Amud Aleph. Amar Rav Amram Lefisha Ein Lomde Mishita Achrona. We don't want to learn anything from that final line. Mipnei she'ein ha'edim yicholim l'karev chasimatan kol kach b'samach b'sof hashtar. We're worried that it will be sometimes difficult for when the witnesses sign. You know, in those days, it was relatively rare that people would sign anything. So people did not have the familiarity with writing, and of course the writing instrument was a quill and ink, so it's even harder to imagine how it was. So people, and so as a result, you wanted to always, because ink bleeds, you would want to sort of, and you're not a professional scribe, you would want to make sure to leave some room between the main text and your signature. And so what the concern was is that maybe the witnesses would have left some lines, a line open between their signature and the text. And so again, they leave open space between the written contract and their signatures. And they can insert there one additional line. The Hilkach Tikkun Rabbanan, and so as a result, the rabbi said, Lachzor me'inyano shel shtar, that you need to go back and repeat the final idea of the contract, b'shita achrona, in that last line. Biltishi yichtov ba davar hatzarich. And now if we go into the Hagot Habach, the Hatzarach, the Hashta im lo yizaifu, the Yosifu la'achar zman. And so as a result, we're worried that we don't want you to go and write in it something now, and as a result, cause it to be added and now a false document. So ein anu, and now if you did that, ein anu mafsidin klum, we end up not losing anything. Because what happens if I have a document that says that I owe you $1,000, Stan. And then Mark and Ken were the signers. But they left a line open. So what did I do on the document before I gave it to you? I wrote on the document, because I'm giving you the IOU. I wrote on the document, but it's only acceptable. You only get this if the Giants win the Super Bowl. So, the point is
It's
that
never gonna happen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's not going to happen this year, that's for sure. So I think they were actually already eliminated. So the point is that this I will have added a condition. Now, of course, that condition won't be earlier in the contract. Well, that's what's going to save you, Stan, because you can't have anything new in the final line. And this new condition that I just added is new. And so as a result, it's a new idea nowhere else in the contract. And so as a result, we're going to ignore it, even though it was in the document. So imlo nilmad heimenu sharei kvar katuv kol zelamala v'gam im zayfo v'yosifu b'shita hachalak she'achar inyano shel shtar sheb'shita achrona bein hashtar le'edim lo ma'alev v'lo morid. We're not going to do anything extra, and we're not going to take anything away from you.
A lot of this is valid today because when you have a will, the original will, the lawyers will tell you don't remove the staples.
Correct.
Don't tamper with it. You make a
Absolutely.
copy, and that's the one you.
Correct. If you want to write on it, write on the copy, not on the original. And not only that, again, don't remove the staples. My wife loves to tell the story of how she brought a will in and the first thing they do is they remove the staples.
Right.
And why do they remove the staples? To see that there's only one set of holes on every page.
That's absolutely right.
Exactly. So velomori sharei ein L'meidin mishita achrona. So even if you were to try to write something, so this is like a greater kind of protection, that even if you were to try to write something, we would say that we would ignore it. All of this is where you don't write in the contract sharir v'kayam. Because if you had written sharir v'kayam, we automatically know where the end of the document is, because sharir v'kayam is always the last words of a document. Myri. So that's the case that we're talking about. Kain nira be'enai, that's what it seems in my eyes. Tama davar, this is the reasoning. Uperusho, and this is the explanation. V'ikar, and this is key and crucial and the correct explanation. Okay, so back into the Gemara. So now, Amrle Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says LeRav Amram, who just made this statement, Minalachha. How do you know it? Meaning, where is this? Where is the source from this? Where did you get that? In fact, we would say that you need to have that the last line of a contract is effectively ignored if there's anything new in it. So, Amar Le, Rav Amram explained, Tanya, we have a brisa. The brisa has two laws, but the first one is the key one for us. If you if the witnesses distance their signatures by 2 lines, pasul. Now the document is invalid. And Rashbam says something remarkable here. Take a look at the Rashbam. First of the wide lines at the bottom of the Rashbam. If we don't have the word sharir v'kayam. So sharir v'kayam allow us to have any amount of separation because, and of course, if you say, oh, those words sound familiar, it's because those are the last, hakol sharir v'kayam, are essentially the last words before we identify the signatories of a ketubah. And so as a result, we actually do this in our written documents, in our written contracts. So if it's not written sharir v'kayam, well then afilu yesh edim shelo nosaf bo davar. Even if the witnesses, if Mark and Ken come and say, yes, we actually did sign 2 lines away from the end of the document, and nothing has been added, and everything is good. Tough luck to you, Stan, because you're trying to collect from me. So that we would say, mikol makom, nonetheless, hai shtara chaspa balma. This contract is all just like a shard of pottery in the world. The who? Shalo naaseh ketikun chachamim. Because you, as the author, because the person who's owed the money, who lends the money, is the one who's responsible for drafting it. And so as a result, you needed to draft it the way you were supposed to draft it. You didn't draft it the way you're supposed to draft it because you either left too many lines or you failed to say sharir v'kayam at the end. So as a result, ukamalva al pedamya. Now all of a sudden, even though you had intended to loan this money to me on a contract so that you would be able to claim from my property, even if I were to later sell my property to Mark or to Ken, you would be able to claim the property away from them. But now as a result, it's as if it was an oral loan, and that means you can only claim from property that I own. Okay, so but shita achat kasher. However, continuing on back in the brisa, right? So now we're in the middle of the dot, fourth line down, fourth line from the bottom. It's very simple. Shita achat kasher. But if there's only one line that separates the witness's signature to the rest of the document, you're totally fine. Now, ma'ishna shnei shitin.
What do you mean can only collect from property that you own?
Sorry?
What did you mean when you said you can only collect from property that you own?
An oral loan can only be collected from property that I currently own. Whereas a written loan can be collected not only from property that I currently own, but for all property I owned at the time that the loan was made and is dated on the contract. So as a result, if I borrow $100,000 from you, Ken, and tomorrow I sell my home, according to Jewish law, anybody who bought that home from me will be, bought it subject to your mortgage on the property and effectively giving you the right to collect it if you can't collect from me. So that's what I was referring to.
Okay. I thought you may have meant that one could collect from future property.
Well, future property, any property that I will eventually own can be potentially property that you collect from, but that will depend on a variety of circumstances, as we've seen over the last couple of months and weeks even. All right, so Shita, so now Rav Amram explains how this brisa proves that we don't learn anything from the last line. So ma'ishna shnei shitin. Why is it that two lines are a problem? Dilma mezayah v'kasav. So it's because maybe he's going to falsify and write an additional clause or an additional line, details. Shita achas nami mezayah v'kasav. Well, 1 second. Why don't we have that concern with respect to one line? Elalav shmamina ein lamedin mishita achrona. Must be that we don't learn from the last line. And shmamina, in fact, that's the case. We don't learn. So let's take a look in the Rashbam, last Rashbam on the page, second line from the bottom. Elalav shmamina ein lamedin mishita achrona. Hilkach shnei shitin pasul. If you separate by two lines, it's going to be invalid, the contract. Because now you can forge two lines. Now, we won't learn from the second of those two lines, but we could learn something new from the first of those two lines. So that's going to be a problem. Okay, so now we've got that. Let's take a look at the Tosos here.
You couldn't learn from the second line if you wrote two lines in there?
No, because you can't learn from the second line, because the second line of those two additional lines is now the last line of the contract. And we don't learn anything from the last line of the contract. So that's why if you leave two lines, it's a problem. But if you leave one line, it's not, because anything that would be added in that final line is not going to be, completely ignored, because it can't do something new. But if you have two lines, now the second of those two lines can be used as the summary line from which we won't learn anything. But if you, in the first of the two lines that get added, you would be able to learn something new. And given that, we're going to say that such a contract is problematic. Okay, so lefisha ein lamedim. So bimehen, Lo hayu kotvin sharir v'kayam, confirming exactly what the Rashbam said. Tosfos adds here, this is the only Tosfos that begins on this page. Tosfos adds here that in those days they did not write sharir v'kayam at the end, because if you wrote sharir v'kayam, as we saw in the Rashbam, then you wouldn't have an issue with leaving over multiple lines. Bipshutin shalahem, in their open contracts. Keda Amar Gabi Mekushar, because we said when it came to a tied one that you needed to write down Sharir V'Kayam, Le'el, because of we now go in because of Bay in the tet is adds the word bay, sharir v'kam. Miklal de pshutim, that when it came to, although we said that with respect to tied contracts, bound contracts, that you would need to have the word sharir v'kayam at the end. When it came to open ones, lo hayu kotvin sharir v'kayam, they didn't used to write it. V'lakach lo hayu lemedin meshita achrona kedei shelo yochel lezayef b'shita achat. So as a result, that's why we say that you can't learn from the last line, because we're worried that we don't want you to again write anything new in that line that comes between the witnesses' signatures and the document itself. And you would write a review of the contract in that last line. The loshum devar ikar, and you wouldn't write anything crucial or necessary. Lefi, as the Yud adds the words Lefi, she'ein l'meidin heimena, okay, because we don't want to learn anything from it. V'im ira bahen machak, what about if there was an erasure? What if there was space? V'hayu kotvin oto, and it was written
There's an erasure.
Oto.
Imiraba machak, he erased something, right?
Yes. Oto hamachak. If in fact it was something new was written in that erasure, v'hayu mekaimen oto kodem shita achrona, you would need to affirm that that erasure was valid in before the final line. Da'acharei came, because once you get to the final line, lo hayu lamedim kol ikar himenu, we wouldn't learn anything from it. All right, so that's the background. So again, what he's saying is he's connecting the two teachings, right? We had two teachings at the bottom of Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Bet. One was that any erasures need to be certified, and we need to restate the document in the final line. Now, those two have a relationship between one another, because what it's telling us is that because the final line can't have anything new, you can't have that certification of the erasures in that final line. That's what Tosfos is saying. Now, v'yesh l'tmoa, but 1 second, there's a big problem. Im kain, if that's so, heichor galnu lichtov kiyom mitchakim achar v'kinyana minei. 1 second, how could we write in our contracts the wording of the fact of what the erasures were after we write the summary of the contract, kodem sharir v'kayam, as the Hagosa Bach adds, and before the words sharir v'kayam. V'ha ein lamedin mishita achrona. 1 second, how can we learn from the last line of a contract? And it seems like v'ein lecha lamedin gadol mizeh, and there's no kind of learning about the contract greater than telling us that the erasures are a valid erasure. V'lo hayu lanu lilmod lefisha yachol lavo lidei ziyuf. Shouldn't we be concerned that people will come and potentially create false documents? Kevan shashtar kasher below sharir v'kayam. After all, our contracts are valid even without the words sharir v'kayam. So shepamim lo yichtov mitchila sharir v'kayam. Maybe originally the document won't have the words sharir v'kayam. V'yavo zeh v'yimchok ma sheyirtza, and the person will erase what he wants. V'yagia, and then he'll v'kayim hamachak b'sof, and then he'll explain and write down the erasures at the end and confirm them. V'yiktov sharir v'kayam, and then he'll write the words sharir v'kayam, because remember, any erasure of the size of sharir v'kayam definitely makes it a problem. So it can't be that it was sharir v'kayam was there and then erased. So it's got to be that there was never sharir v'kayam. So why aren't we worried about that? So Tosos answers, V'yesh Lomer, Kevin Shehur Galnu, Lichtov, Sharir V'Kayam. Since our practice is to always write Sharir V'Kayam, Yehe Psul, Im Lo Nichtav Kain. It's going to be, we need to treat any document as invalid if it doesn't have those words. Afilu Kishein Bo Machak, even if there was no erasure whatsoever. V'hashta, and now if we do that, Lo yachol lidei ziyuf. So now we don't have to worry about the confirmation of the erasures coming after the summary in the last line and just before sharir v'kayam. Because when we have sharir v'kayam, you can learn things even from the last line. Lekach anu kosim shapir kiyum mechakim achar v'kinyan amine. And so that's why we're able to write the fact that we are confirming the erasures after we've written the summary of the contract. And so it makes sense that we can learn from the final line of the document. Since we write sharir v'kayam. So I thought that was an interesting Tosos that provides some scope and perspective on what we're doing. So now we turn to
But Tosfos said above that the practice was not to write sharir v'kayam.
No. Yeah, the practice at the time of the Gemara, and in connection with this Gemara was, and that's why the most important word that you were skipping is bimehem, the very first word of that Tosos. In those days, not in biyameinu. Not in our days. In our days, we write sharir v'kayam, and that's why you can write the erasure details immediately before sharir v'kayam, even though it's on the last line. Okay, so now we turn to the Kuf Samach Bet Amud Bet Ibailahu. The Gemara asks.
How does he explain the Gemara, the practice of the Gemara then? He says, okay, we changed our practice. Now we do write sharir v'kayam, but then they didn't. So how does he stem the Gemara to what they were doing at the time that the Gemara was done?
That's why in the Gemara's time, they would have to write any summary of erasures. That's in fact what he said specifically. Any summary of erasures would have to come in not the last line. It would have to come before the summary of the document. That's exactly what Tosos wrote. And that's what the implication of our Gemara is. That's exactly why Tosos wrote that. 100%. Okay, so Ibailahu, Shita Umechtzamai. What's the story if we leave a line and a half? Meaning we don't leave just one line, we leave 1.5 lines. So we're going to offer 2 efforts to answer this. The first will be rejected, and then we'll have the second. Tashma, Hirchi Kesa Edim Shnei Shitin. Let's take a look at the brisa we cited just 2 seconds ago. Puzzle. So we said that if you distance by 2 lines, then the contract is pasul. Hashita Umechza kasher. Well, what's the implication of that? If you were to distance by 1.5 lines, it's kosher. So doesn't that prove for us? No, it doesn't work because Ema Seifa. What about the end of that? Shita achat kasher, shita achat hu de kasher, hashita umechza puzzle. Once again, maybe we could read it that the implication is that it's only 1 line that's kosher, and 1.5 lines is a problem. So as a result, so as a result, we can't learn anything from that brisa. So my hava Allah. So how did we resolve it? So Tashma, listen to the next brisa. Titanya, if the distance was 2 lines, pasul, pachot mikan, but anything less than that, well then kasher, then it is kosher. I get the implication being that if any line, that if one of the last lines of the contract are written very, very small, then we would also, that would be effectively a sign that we should, that there's a problem. So hayu arba v'chamisha Edim Chasumin al Ashtar. So new topic now, but again, it's a continuation of the brisa that we just brought, which proved our case. So as a result, we're just going to continue the rest of the brisa. So if there were 4 or 5 witnesses who signed on the document, v'nimtza echad mehen karav u'pasol, and it was found that one of them was a relative or otherwise disqualified, titkayem edut bishar. The testimony of the others can confirm the document. Now, wow, that's actually a remarkable thing. So Rashbam adds some additional language here. If we take a look, third line in the Rashbam on Kuf Samach Bet Amabet, Hayu arba o chamisha edim chasumim al ashtar. There are 4 or 5 witnesses who signed on this contract. V'nimtza. Now he says Shnayim Rishonim. Let's see, what does the bet add here? V'nimtzu Shnayim Rishonim, and it's found that the first 2 Krovim are Psulim. Titkayem Edut Bishar. Then you can accept the rest. So the point is that according to the Rashbam, when the Gemara says that that 3 or 4 of the witnesses could be validated, as long as there 2 or 3 of the witnesses can be sufficient, as long as it is only if the bad witnesses are the first witnesses to sign. And now Rashbam explains, Perish imhaya beinaksav la'edim chala kashir shnei shitim. What happens if there's an amount of space between the witnesses who are signing to validate the contract and the contract itself, 2 lines? How do you deal with it? Umile makom hachalak bekrovim hashtar. So what happens is the sofer who's writing it goes to somebody, and it doesn't make a difference, even if they're a relative, and says, add your line here. Because adding your line, hahu kasher, so then now the contract will be kosher. Umekaimen oto mishar ha'edim shabo. And we can fulfill and confirm the contract with the other witnesses. So even though those witnesses, the witnesses at the top, are invalid, it's essentially a case where we'll say that an invalid witness is good because it eliminates the line, the blank line, and so as a result, we don't have a blank line at all. And now let's take a look back into the Gemara, and this is Messiah. This is a support or proof for, and this is 1, 2, 3. Messiah is the last word on the 5th to last line in the Gemara. Messiah le'lechizkiya. This supports Chizkiya. Da'amr Chizkiya milahu bikrovim kasher. That you can fill up space with relatives, and it will be kosher. But al titma, and don't wonder about this. Meaning, don't be surprised that this is legal, because listen to the following: Shaharei Avir Sukkah Posel Bishlosha, that when it comes to a sukkah, if you have 3 tvachim squared of air, now all of a sudden the sukkah is not kosher, because you have too much no schach. You need to have schach over the entire sukkah. So, but schach pasul posel ba'arba. But when it comes to pasul schach, it takes 4. And so let's take a look at the Rashbam here, because he explains some of the idea, and then we'll take a look, if there's time, at Tosos. So Shaharei Sukkah. This is Rashbam 1, 2, 3, 6, 9 lines down in the Rashbam. I think I said Rashba, but I meant Rashbam. Rashbam Shaharei Sukkah. Shviyot ba'avir shlosha tfachim psula. If you have 3 tfachim of air, it's pasul. However, v'im milo b'schach pasul. But if in that pasul sukkah you were to now take a metal slab and just cover that portion with, or any of that portion, even 1 tefach, even if it's exactly 3 tefachim, even an inch of that space with a metal slab, now all of a sudden could go bedavar makabel tuma, like with something that is capable of becoming tamei. Hook shara sukkah. Now the sukkah suddenly becomes kosher. She'ain schach pasul posel ela ba'arba tfachim, because you need 4 tfachim of pasel schach. Now, Tosos asks the obvious question. Take a look at third line down. Well, it's somewhat implied by his question, but let's take a look. I'm sorry, no, it's a third to last Tosos on the page. The altit mashahare avir posel b'shlosha. Don't be surprised by this law that says that a relative or invalid witness can sign and it will still be a kosher document, because after all, we have the rule of heir nullifying a sukkah with 3 tfachim, but pasel schach not requiring 4. V'im tomar amailo maisi raya meget kareach. Why didn't we bring a proof from a get kareach? Now, get kareach, which is dealt with as the tet here points us to gittin pay aleph on a bet, that is dealing with a situation where you have a get kashur, a bound get, where you require signatures on each of the folds, and so as a result, it's missing some of those signatures. Well, but now it has at least 2 signatures, 2 valid signatures, but you're missing signatures on some of the folds. So as long as you can have anybody sign, even relatives sign, to make up that additional space. Sha'avir posel. There we have heir it nullifies that and makes it a get kireach, a pasel get. The karov mashlim, but a relative can fill in space and make it valid. So why are we bringing a proof from a completely unrelated topic of sukkah? Let's bring a proof that is directly related to contracts and have it be in connection with a divorce decree. No, the point is that situation is also a rabbinic decree. And we need some support for taking this approach from a biblical source. V'im tomer ma'ishayach tam pasel avir haget lepasel avir hasukah. But then Tosos asks again, well, but again, how do you get from pasel heir to pasel space on a contract? Those are different things. The yesh lomar hakikamer. This is what it's trying to say. Mileyu bikrovim kasher. Now, when we say that you can fill in with relatives, it's kosher. And va'aval gavta avir pasol. Now, even though if it was actual space, it would be pasol. Ein ligzor milui krovim atu avir. We don't need to nullify a contract where the first lines were signed by relatives, because maybe we'll allow a contract that had space in it. And how do I know that we won't make that gzeira? Shaharei avir pasul bishlosha upasul lo upsul lo posel ela ba'arba. Because the same principle, it could apply with respect to schach, that we could say that maybe we should say that even 3 tfachim of pasul schach should be posel to sukkah. Because maybe you'll come to allow 3 tfachim of air, and the answer is aval b'shlosha lo pasli. We don't actually say that. We don't say that 3 tfachim is sufficient. V'lo gazrin and ata shlosha to avir pasel, and we don't say that maybe 3 tfachim of air we will because that you may come to allow 3 tfachim of air, and which is pasel, and so therefore we're not going to say, just as we don't say by sukkah that we should make a gzeira in one case of the filled-in case based on the empty case, so too we're not going to make a gzeira here based on the filled-in case because you may come to the empty case. So that is.
But it is pasel, isn't? But wait a second. But the sukkah, shlosha avir is pasel.
Shlosha avir is pasel, but shlosha tvachim of pasel schach is not pasel.
Wow.
That's the point. So I might have thought that we should make a gzeira that when it comes to 3 tvachim of pasel schach, we should, I might have thought that we should make a gzera when it comes to 2 lines of open text, that when it comes to the signatures of the relatives in those 2 lines of text, because maybe I will come to allow 2 lines of open text, which of course is not valid. So we're not going to make that gzera, because we similarly don't make a gzera about 3 tvachim of puzzle schach. That we don't say that we should make 3 tvachim of puzzle schach puzzle just because 3 tvachim of air is puzzle. And so as a result, we're similarly not going to make the gzera when it comes to the signatures either.
So therefore, one can have 2 lines of
relatives, of relative
relatives unauthenticated or relatives that are not legitimate.
Or witnesses that are not legitimate, as long as they're the first 2, according to the Rashbam. Now we're going to see. Let's see. Do we have time?
That's
we have a little
lines.
bit of time. So let's do the last.
So then, where is the final line of the document then?
I'm sorry. Say that again.
Well, if we fill in
the lines of the signatures of the witnesses. First of all, because they're not telling us anything new about the contract, they can be, we can view them as lines of the contract. But the bottom line is that the last line of those last lines of the contract, would be either the actual line where it, where you have the summary. But the bottom line is that those lines don't tell us anything new, so we can treat them as if they were part of the contract and not part of the signatures. And it's just like nonsense.
Even if they appear after the summary of the contract.
Correct, because they're not telling us anything new. So as a result, they don't tell us anything new, and so as a result, it's totally fine to have them there.
So we could have So we could have 10 lines of this, right? 20 lines.
Yes, yeah. I mean, as long you can have, as long as the bottom lines are the valid, then now maybe one could say that once you have more than 2, and again you get, because again Rashbam specifically says v'nimtzeu shnayim harishonim krovim, so maybe only the first 2. You could say that witnesses don't leave that much space, and so as a result, it's unlikely. Therefore, if it was more than 2 witnesses, then maybe we'd have a problem. So you can't necessarily say that because 2 is okay, any number would be okay. But yes, some of the logic would apply even to larger numbers. But again, I would say that this is only with respect to 2, but I haven't really looked into actually how we paskin.
You say, now when you say 2, you mean 2 krovim or 2 lines?
2, both. 2 krovim in 2 lines. Every witness gets their own lines. Okay, and that's important. Every witness gets their own line. All right, let's take a quick look. Let's see if we can do this very quickly. The last Tosfos, maybe we'll do it outside. Tosfos wonders, how can we allow the nullification of 1 or 2 of a group of witnesses when we generally have a principle that if witnesses were to come in and testify in front of us, that we would say that the nullification of any of the witnesses nullifies the entire group of witnesses. And so Tosfos answers that is true about oral testimony, because there the witnesses clearly came to testify. Indeed, we asked them, are you coming to testify? And they need to say yes. But here, the invalid signatures may have signed simply to fill in the space and not to testify. And of course, this is true according to some wherever the signature falls. But Rav Yehudai, the Gaon, says rules that only when the top witnesses who signed, just like the Rashbam says, and the Rashbam got it from him, only when the top witnesses are the ones who signed are invalid. That's when the document would be kosher. But if they signed at the end, then it would be invalid. Now, you may be wondering,
how do you identify the witnesses? You have to know who's a valid witness versus who's a non-valid.
Oh, absolutely. Of course you have to know that. But the key is that it would seem like only if the invalid witnesses are the top two, and because then we can argue that they're just filling in space. They aren't trying to testify. But if they were trying to testify, well, then because of the principle that if one out of a group of witnesses is invalidated, the entire group is invalidated, well, then it would be a problem if any of the signatories were invalidated.
Would you hold that way?
That's certainly what it would seem like. I have not looked at
That if one
the
witness
halacha.
is invalid, the whole document is invalid?
If in general we say that if in general in testimony we absolutely say that if one witness is invalid, the whole document is invalid. And usually in our contracts we only have two witnesses, so if one of them is invalidated, the whole document is invalidated. That's correct.
So is this considered testimony?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly writing a line on signing on a contract is considered testimony. Yes. Indeed, that's why a document has such emphasis and has such some presumption of being valid, is because it's essentially treated as if it was actual testimony. So now,
So how can we say then the witnesses that we're allowed to fill up a line or two lines with invalid witnesses? If we have one invalid witness, the testimony becomes invalid then, right?
that was that we just spent the last 5 minutes explaining that. The point is that when it comes to written testimony, and it's the first two lines of the contract, we can say that the reason that these witnesses signed in these two spaces was to fulfill up the line and was not about testimony. And so as a result, that's why in that situation we'll allow those witnesses, even though they're invalid witnesses, to have signed their name because they're in the first two lines and are just there to fill up the space. And so as a result, that's going to be okay.
Right,
but in an ordinary case, in a case where that we don't have that issue, then if you have one invalid witness, and again, in most contracts, we don't have 3 witnesses or 4 witnesses. We just have the 2 witnesses, and you need 2 witnesses. And so if you don't have the 2 witnesses, if one of them is invalid, you're not going to have a valid contract.
Okay. So that depends on the number of witnesses then.
Of course.
Okay, that's the point.
But also the nature of the contract. Meaning if you have a contract that ends sharir v'kayam, so therefore any number of spaces could be valid, meaning in our modern day contracts, if you had a false witness, I presume it would be invalid. Again, I did not look up the halacha here, but I presume it would be invalid because in all our contracts, because it says sharir v'kayam at the end, you can have as much blank space as you want at the bottom. It's because it's valid, because it says sharir v'kayam at the end. And so as a result, any witness that actually signs on the document is really testifying and therefore is part of the testimony. So that would be my sense. Again, I have not done any detailed analysis of the halacha, but we're still in the middle of the discussion. And now the question is, what about line spacing? We talked about 2 lines, right, but what if those lines have 0 spacing between them? Is that also going to be a problem? And that's precisely what we're going to talk about next. So stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. Looking forward to continuing.
There's no space between the lines? What do you mean?
Meaning, if here, like a look at the screen, right? Okay. If you take a look at the screen, you can see the top of the letter T in the word this is well below the bottom of the letter W. It's right above it in the line before it. That's because there's line spacing. The line spacing is crucial for being able to read a document. Now, we said that you need to have 2 lines, that if you have 2 lines of open space, it's a problem. Well, what happens if the 2 lines of open space are only 2 lines with 0 line spacing between them? Does that also create a problem because you could squeeze in those 2 lines? Or does the fact that they're 2 lines exactly and they end up being mushed together, that would be a problem? And so as a result, that's the topic that we're going to talk about as the beginning of the day tomorrow. So if you have any further questions on that, you got to come tomorrow. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.